interviews and press conversations, but today we want to move from the data to action. And we're so glad that you have joined us today, because as I look across this room, I know that there are individuals who are about getting the work done. We can ruminate and talk about the data and how dire it is, but unless we use that data as both an individual and collective cause of action, the data is just words on a paper. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves in having this conversation this morning. My role right now is to simply welcome you, to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us, but to thank you for being a part of this movement to improve the state of Black Chicago and to improve the plight of our citizens in Chicago, one movement, one person, one organization at a time. And so at this time, I'm going to welcome to the podium the person who has been one of our key partners in the development of this morning's activity, Karen Weiger, who is the executive director of the Baumhart Center at Loyola. Karen.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Karen. It's a distinct pleasure to join all of you today, and a distinct pleasure to be a part of this conversation, particularly the conversation that is leading from data to impact. And I'm thrilled to join, not just because I get to follow another Karen, who's also from Indiana, but because this is about making another move, and that's the move from the data and the information to the action and the progress. And this conversation really about promising practices. And we're part of this conversation and thrilled to be here because I lead the Baumhart Center for Social Enterprise and Responsibility at Loyola. And that is really about supporting established and emerging leaders at the intersection of profit and purpose. It is about growing that intersection, particularly here in Chicago. And I'm delighted that we are able to lead and support leaders throughout their career, particularly with an MBA program that is anchored in social and environmental impact. I like to think of it as leaders from all of Chicago, for all of Chicago and the world. And I'm delighted that Jonathan is here today. But quite simply, this is an opportunity to take the knowledge that we have, the information and the research that has been delivered, and translate that across the sectors of our economy for all of us, so that the 2024 State of Black Chicago shows that there was action today and in the days to come. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Karen.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Karen. We have at least two good Karens in the room today. So as we start this conversation, I want to first introduce what I think we will all agree is a very distinguished set of panelists. First, we're joined by Jonathan McGee, and I think I can call him safely the baby of the bunch, who is a senior consultant for economic development and community advisory at Baker Tilly, US. And previously, we worked very closely with Jonathan in his role as the director of office and or the Director of the Office of Business and Workforce Diversity for the Illinois Department of Transportation. And of course, Jonathan is a Baumhart Scholar. We are also pleased to be joined by Theresa Chapple, Dr. Theresa Chapple, who is an epidemiologist who serves as the Public Health Director for the Village of Oak Park. She conducts research that considers health disparities and the health of underserved populations. We are also joined by Dr. Malik Henfield, who is one of the authors of the report and also a full professor and founding dean of the Institute for Racial Justice at Loyola University. And Malik served previously as a senior advisor for the Research and Policy Institute here at the Urban League. And then last but not least, we have Marisa Novara, who is the Vice President of Community Impact for the Chicago Community Trust. Marisa has more than 25 years of experience engaging with communities to develop innovative programs and is the former commissioner for the City of Housing for the City of Chicago. Please give it up for our panel. Okay, so in the state of Black Chicago, and I want to just provide some general information as we go into this conversation, because I know that some of you have read the executive summary, some of you have read the full report in detail, and some of you haven't read it at all. But that's okay, because this isn't an exam. It really is an opportunity to understand the data so that we can be impactful in our community. But in just about every measure, we saw that Blacks were not behind their white and Latino counterparts, but they were significantly behind in income, in home ownership, in educational attainment. We saw marked health disparities, and we also saw that these challenges that I've just outlined for you were present in significant ways in 27 of the 77 neighborhoods in our city. Because we saw in those 27 neighborhoods that there was more than a 85% concentration of Black residents in those neighborhoods. And while that underscores how segregated we are, I think it also underscores that if we focus strategy in those 27 neighborhoods, that we could make a significant difference. And I would say that that is probably one of the greatest benefits of that data and of understanding the data. But given the dire nature of what we've seen in the data, what do you think, and this is to our panel, as we look at those sobering statistics, what do you think that, from the perspective of your work, how do you think you have the ability to make a change given these statistics? And I'll start with you, John.
Well, one, thank you for that introduction, Karen, and thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel. I feel like this is such a momentous, I got my grad school here, and I've got former colleagues from the trust and the state in the room. And I'll start with just saying that it's very simple. It's awareness and preparedness. And I want to start there because, you know, everyone, we talk about the programs, we talk about the policies, but many people in neighborhoods like Bronzeville, in neighborhoods like South Shore, in neighborhoods like Roseland, in neighborhoods across the city, many of them are at capacity, right? They're thinking day to day, especially small businesses. And seeing BLC in the room and Ariel and others, when you were in the pandemic, we saw it. Right, stare us in the face. We have to start by standing in solidarity with the community, making sure that we educate them, right, on what we're trying to do, and that's actually what they want to do, but then translate this stuff. So when you talk about affordable housing, many folks are renting, we don't even know what that threshold is. When you talk about entrepreneurship and grants and loans and tax incentives, I'm just trying to balance my books, and I'm the janitor, I'm the owner, I don't got time to come to a meeting, right? And so then on top of that, who's here to help me? I know the Urban League's there, but where's the ecosystem? And so when we start to talk about solutions, what was exciting when I was at the state was that we started what we called a community navigator program. And it was simple, right? We're here from the government, we're here to help, and that's a joke, right? Many people do not trust government. They feel like they can't hold us accountable, right? And even in some cases, corporations, right? Or developers, or all these folks that are coming into our community saying that they want to help us create jobs and economic opportunity. And so it starts with working with organizations like the Urban League, who have built that trust with the community, economic development organizations, chambers, who they do have those one-to-one relationships because they are doing the business coaching. And so what we did was say, let's fund them. Let's supercharge what they're doing, because in a pandemic, we can't afford to lose a business in neighborhoods that are already suffering. And so what happened was we put $10 million in that program. We saw 40% of the funds go to minority-owned enterprises. We saw more awareness and preparedness around government programs in general. And then you saw the SBA come in, Isabel Guzman say, you know what, we think this is a model for the nation. And put $100 million into this program nationally. And so now the National Urban League is funded through that. So that's ecosystems that are in markets across the nation. And so at Baker Tilly, many people are like, well, how do you make money and still have impact? Well, I'm gonna tap into the resources that are already there. And so I just wanna start by saying that. I think it's starting with awareness and preparedness. It's building those coalitions and partnerships and starting to cultivate that ecosystem, and then thinking about what's missing, right? And how do we move the needle from there?
Thanks for raising that community navigator program, Jonathan. In fact, we are one of the providers of services for that community navigator program, along with the Aurora Urban League. And so you raise a great example of a solution. And we know that at the state and the city level, there was sort of this emergency support for businesses, but ultimately it became permanent through the Community Navigator program. And so if you have a business, we would just encourage you to take advantage of that support, because it's real and it can make a difference as you provide services to the community. Dr. Chapple, I want to ask you, you are in the health field. You see health disparities every day. How do you see those statistics? But more importantly, how does it play out in you developing solutions?
So I spent my career really focused on racial inequities in health. And for me, it's really important to talk about inequities, because that means that the differences that we're seeing in health outcomes are unfair, they're unjust, they don't have to be, and that there's a social context that are driving these differences that we see in health outcomes. So I think for a long time in our health field, we've really focused on like, what can medicine do? What different medications can we push? How can we try to see changes in health outcomes because of that? But once we realized that it's not medical, the reasons why we're seeing these differences in our health outcomes, it's because of treatment. It's how Black folk are being treated in this country that then manifests in bad health outcomes. So what can we do about making sure that people have the education that they need to be able to push back against the negative things that are said to them or the negative treatment that they're getting from their providers? What can we do at the community level? What can we do at the policy level? How can we really impact these drivers of bad health? And so that's what I spent my career doing, and that's what I try and focus on. I look at those three levels. How can I impact health from policy, community, and individual? So I'm just gonna take one health outcome. Maternal mortality. Black women die 3 times more than white women by solely trying to birth a person, bringing a new person into the world. This should be the healthiest, happiest time of a family. And for too many Black people, that's the time when they're mourning the loss of their matriarch, right? So what can we do? From a policy level, I can take racism out of play at the policy level. I can't put in a policy that says don't be racist, right? But we've all lived through the pandemic. We've seen that public health can come in and say, you gotta do this and you can't do that. So one thing we can do with policy is say, you have to treat everybody exactly the same way. Here are the steps. These are the things you must go through whenever you come across someone in a delivery setting. If that person has hypertension, here are the 10 things you have to do. You can't skip a step. You can't decide that, oh, they're not gonna listen, so I'm just not gonna offer this opportunity or whatever. You have to go through all these 10 steps. If we systematize what happens in the delivery room, then I can make sure that not only I get good treatment, but that my sister does who doesn't have the same degrees that I do, and that we're getting the same care and treatment as any other person in the community, right? So that's what I can do from a policy level. From a community level, I can have these kind of conversations and say, listen, health inequities are because of the way that we are treated, and we can push so that we don't have to be treated this way anymore. We can demand better education. We can demand better paying jobs. We can demand that health insurance not be linked to our jobs. So if we lose our job while pregnant, we don't then have lost our health insurance and have to now find a new doctor who can take us, who doesn't know us, who doesn't care for us, all that kind of stuff, right? So what can we do with community organizing that can then lead to better health outcomes? And then at the individual level, one thing that we can do is start to think about ways that we can change in incremental steps. What are some things that we can do differently to live healthier lives? But I want us to know that that last piece is going to impact about 20% of our health, and that the other 2 pieces is what's going to impact the other 80% of our health. So there is a role for us, but when you hear people push, you need to do this, you need to do that, it's because they're telling you the lazy route. You do need to do this. However, the system and the community need to do more to help.
So you talk about systemic change, and I talked about the 27 neighborhoods where Blacks were concentrated. Would one of those solutions be then to focus infant and maternal health in those 27 neighborhoods? Not to just say those are the only neighborhoods that are going to get those services, but to really highlight and emphasize those services in those neighborhoods.
One thing that we did wrong in public health for too long was think about the rising tides raise all boats approach. Like, yeah, but if your boat has started off too low, you're never going to get to where everyone is. We need to have infused policies, infused programs, infused systems that go right to where the help is needed in order to bring that group up to have experienced optimal health that others are already experiencing.
Thank you for that. Malik, you are one of the authors of this report. But I also know that you didn't start out at Loyola as the founding dean of the Institute for Racial Justice. You actually started out in the Department of Education as the dean, but you felt so strongly about what you saw and about the murder of George Floyd that you undertook a much broader role, and the statistics that we see are indicative of why you took on that role. Would you talk about how you see the Institute for Racial Justice and your work there as being a solution to some of the challenges that we see?
Absolutely. And to begin, I want to give full credit to the authors of the report. Dr. Twyla Blackman-Larnell couldn't be here today. She's an associate professor in the political science department at Loyola. We have Dr. Chandra, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Racial Justice. And we also have a community researcher, Jillian Giles, who I just saw step into the room. So that was the formal team. I was in the back seat and they were in the front seat. Just want to be perfectly clear about that. But yes, I did come to Loyola as the dean of the School of Education in the summer of 2019. Fast forward to 2020, we're talking about the pandemic. We're talking about George Floyd. It was extremely overwhelming. And for those of you who read the full report, if you look on page 9 at the very bottom, you'll see a little graph that kind of explains why I decided to make a shift, a career shift, to the Institute for Racial Justice. In that graph, you'll see that, and first let me even back up and say, what I don't want us to do is to continue to have this white-black dichotomous conversation around all that ails us. When you look at that graph, you'll see that there is white, there's black, but there's also Asian and Latino. We live in a very diverse community, a very diverse city, and we have to start getting out of the mindset of black and white. We're living in a time where, quite honestly, there are lots of pushes and pulls for power in our city, with black folks feeling as though we're losing as a function of people leaving this city. These are conversations that need to be had, because we heard from the folks on the panel earlier about the need for coalition building and so on and so forth. Before we can partner with other ethnicities beyond our own, we have to take care of home first. We have to be fully aware of what ails us. And there's any number of recommendations that can be made. You have African descendants of slavery who want reparations on this end. Then you have folks on the other end, so to speak, who might want a payment here or there. We may never agree, but we have to come to some realization that we have to come away from the table together with a plan to move forward. And that's why I left the School of Education. So going back to that graph, what you'll see, if we're taking out white folks, when we're thinking about Asian, Hispanic, and black folks, white folks, black folks in terms of academic outcomes, we're right there in the middle. But then when we look at life outcomes, poverty, home ownership, we're at the very bottom. That needs to be discussed. How can we be beating, so to speak, other ethnicities in educational outcomes, but still be at the bottom of the well in terms of life outcomes? So when I'm sitting there in my position as Dean of the School of Education, I'm just thinking to myself, education will not save us. And the data is bearing that out. In cities, not just Chicago, in cities all across the country. Chicago, of the top 10 cities for black folks in terms of population, there's only one that's not losing population, black population, and that's Houston. And many of the folks from Chicago are heading to places like Houston. Right? So we have to have conversations around our continuous focus on education, again, as the savior that will solve all of our ills, and have a more nuanced conversation around the things that we're talking about on this panel today. And that is the reason why I left the School of Education and started the Institute for Racial Justice, which is meant to do exactly what we're doing right now, bringing people from all walks of life to be in conversation with one another, honest conversation with one another about what's really happening and the path forward.
So you raised something that may be sort of the hidden lead. education will not save us. I mean, I think everybody in this room has had the education conversation with their parents and your grandparents. Get your education, because education is the one thing that what? They can't take away. But you say that education won't save us. Now, I know that you're not, as a PhD, saying not to get an education. I understand that, but I really want you to kind of drill down, because along with that education conversation comes a lot of debt. Comes a lot of hype. I mean, everybody has to go to school. We know that's not true. So I really want you to kind of break that down for us.
Absolutely. So I want to be on the record. On the record, education is important for all of us. Let's be perfectly clear about that in no uncertain terms. But what I'm saying is education alone will not save us. There is a debt that we are owed in no uncertain terms. Let's be clear about that. And oftentimes what happens is that we put the onus, going back to what Dr. Chapple shared earlier, on the individual to go back to school and get their education, forgetting about the systemic variables at play that have positioned us to feel as though that's our only way out, so to speak. And I love the conversation because we have an example of how we can operate fully when government works. The pandemic gave us concrete examples of what it looks like to function optimally, which is why I'm so excited to have Marisa and Novara here, given her time in the mayor's office and some of the work that she accomplished during her stay there. There's so many lessons to be learned. And one of the lessons that I want us to learn is let's be clear, education is important. Let's be clear about that, absolutely. However, when we're thinking about entrepreneurship, when we're thinking about public policies related to health and the things that are related to optimal living, that any human being, regardless of background, should come to expect to receive. When we look at the data, we see the outcomes, and we understand that it's not about us, it's about the environment we're in. We need to come together with our educated folks in terms of formal education. And let's be clear, part of why I co-created the Institute for Racial Justice is because I feel as though faculty alone and research will not save us either. Folks who are living in communities outside of the academic environment are closest to the solutions. So how can we, as academics, say this is what you ought to do? We don't know. You all know. And again, when I look across this room, this is the outcome of that vision. We envision a reality where we have faculty working with folks from the community like Jillian Giles, who also are producing work that's being reviewed by folks at the Chicago Urban League to make sure that we're not wrong, to make sure that we're not assuming certain things are possible when folks on the ground understand that we've tried that academic and it didn't work. But again, we do have examples of things that have worked. What we have to do is document those examples, understand how it came to be, and replicate it to the best of our ability moving forward.
Thank you. Marisa, you have really dedicated your life's work to solving and addressing many of the challenges that we see, certainly in your present role at the Community Trust, but also when you were with the City of Chicago in the Housing Department, and even back when we met at MPC. Talk about how you see solutions developing and what your observations have been in that respect.
Sure, thank you. So maybe you brought up MPC, so maybe I'll just start there for a moment. When I was at the Metropolitan Planning Council, I led a study that tried to quantify what segregation costs the Chicago region, so racial and economic segregation. And part of my goal there was really to see if we could have a different conversation about how the costs of segregation and the ways that they are distributed across communities and across races. I think sometimes we have a some problems with our language, in that people in my field of urban planning and so on often use the word segregation as if it's synonymous with majority black places only, or majority brown spaces only, ignoring how many majority white spaces we have that are, generally entirely created by choice. And so my interest was not in creating data that would make anyone feel sorry for white people. It was instead to kind of broaden the conversation to say, I think this has negatives for everybody. And I think until we acknowledge that, there may not be, the moral compass on this issue alone had not proven sufficient to move policy. So we actually did find significant problems across the board that accrued across the board. So were the Chicago region to drop to the median level of segregation across the country, what we found was that we would experience, we would gain 4.4 billion more in African American income, which translates to 8 billion in the region's GDP, 30% less homicides, and 120,000 more bachelor's degrees. So what was important to me in that conversation, and it was to be really clear that this was not in any way a statement that there's something wrong with majority black or majority brown spaces. Quite the opposite. It was actually to say that let's all acknowledge that it makes it easier and more efficient to discriminate against people when you can draw a circle around where they live and target accordingly. And that was true back when that was being done through things like redlining and racial covenants and selling on contract. But unfortunately, it's still true today when you think about things like predatory lending or no lending at all, or very, very little lending. And so to me, the purpose of that kind of look is really to shine a really bright light on how racism shows up differently in those communities and allow us to have a different conversation then about what needs to happen, right? I'll, be Captain Obvious and just say, majority black spaces have been systematically disinvested in and devalued, and since the start of the Great Migration in 1916. And so, to build off of Andre Perry, whose book I just read for an event next week, he said we owe a debt to people who've stayed and fought in places, and I'll add this, the Chicago context was, quote, stayed and fought for places like Englewood and North Lawndale, and they are assets worthy of investment.
So you have just laid out the case for reparations. And I know that wasn't an accident.
I'm not in government anymore, so I can say certain things.
But here's my question. How do you really press that case with the folks who have both the power and the resources to make it happen? With banks, you talked about racial covenants, with governmental entities. We know that they have the ability to do those things that they deem important. We saw it during COVID, we see it during wartime. How do you make that case?
So it's a really important question, and I think something I come back to saying over and over again is that every single one of us in every sector is accountable for our outcomes, not for our intent. So if we look at banks, for instance, and we know that the big banks in Chicago are lending at cents on the dollar in majority black neighborhoods compared to majority white neighborhoods. And they might argue, look, we are open to everyone and we apply our policies equally across the board. So what am I gonna do when that's my outcomes? I'm open for business, but this is what I get. This is why I say we are accountable to our outcomes, not our intent. So maybe in an industry where we're screening out black and brown would-be homebuyers, for instance, at record levels, we need to look differently at how we ascertain things like credit. Maybe we don't look simply at a credit score. Maybe we look at rental payment history. Maybe we look at things like the appraisal industry and try to come up with something that makes up for the fact that we know that houses in majority black neighborhoods are priced less than they're worth. We know this. But if we keep relying on a cost comparison approach, we're just going to keep recreating the problem. So to me, that goes back to something I did at the Department of Housing. We did a racial equity impact assessment of our own work. And that is how you hold yourself accountable. It's self-accountability, and in our case, it was very public. We looked at how we had invested low-income housing tax credits over the past 20 years. And we got all our data, we disaggregated it by race and by geography, and we published the results. And we took a big gulp and said, here they are, they're not all pretty, and here's what they tell us we need to do differently. Because we've been doing the same thing and then saying, look at that, look at where that gets us. Well, what are you gonna do? Well, what you're gonna do is change how you do it. That's what you're gonna do. So that's what we did. So that's using forms of self-accountability, and if an institution doesn't feel compelled to do that, then I think that's where those of us in community-based organizations and in philanthropy and in government need to raise the pressure to do that.
So you're talking about the accountability of institutions, and I want to come back to you, Theresa, because you deal with a set of institutions that seem to be insurmountable. I don't know if anybody has ever had to get something from a hospital or a doctor or a medical entity. It's a tall order. You almost need a PhD. How do you hold those institutions accountable, particularly as we deal with big pharma and the havoc that whether you're talking about the opioid crisis or whether you're talking about just the high cost of required or common medicines? How do you deal with institutions in your stratosphere?
Money. They all care about money. So the question is, what can we do to help you either make a better bottom line, or how can we attack your bottom line because you're not doing the things that we need in our community? So those are the two ways I come at it. I'm always trying to build relationships. So I will start first by, what can we do together? How can I make things better for you and for the community? And when that gets me nowhere, then I will kind of say, how can I find you for the things that you should be doing for the community that you're not doing for the community? And so that gives us lots of opportunities. So you mentioned opioids. So all the big pharma have now gone through lawsuits because of the opioid crisis. We now take that opioid crisis money and turn it back around and give it to the community. The big pharma came in, did something horrendous to the community. So now we will take that money and we will make it to the benefit of the community. And hopefully showing examples like that will stop the next time. But even if it doesn't, it will then give us another opportunity to take a bad and make it good for our community. When we're thinking about things like hospitals have to give back 5% of their profit to the community. So as a community, what do you want from your hospital? You can go to these board meetings, you can make it clear, you have to give back some of this money to us. We have a problem with hypertension. We have a problem with diabetes. We need classes in our community to help people know how to grocery shop better, or how to take the food they bought at the grocery store and cook it better at home. This is what we want you to spend your 5% community benefit on, right? If you come to the table with ideas, they will listen, because otherwise they're sitting there trying to come up with ideas that's gonna pass muster with the feds. So they have to write down what they spent their 5% on, okay? So this is a way that we can push and promote the things that we need in our community.
Thank you for that. Jonathan, I want to really ask you about the Baumhart Scholar Program as a source of potential solutions, because you're a Baumhart Scholar. Would you talk about that? In what I also know is that Quentin Arthur who is a member of the CUL team, is a Baumhart Scholar, and we have a number of Baumhart Scholars who are present today. Please talk about that.
So Karen, I think you teed that up nicely because, what Marisa talked about was the rules being applied evenly. What Malik talked about is how education can't save us alone. And what Theresa talked about was the levels, right, in which we can attack this. And so what the Baumhart program did for me, it's helped me understand that, and this sounds cliche, the public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors can drive impact together and make money. It can happen. It's happening at 43 Green right now, where Philip Beckham is the black developer. It's a mixed-use project. He's got funding from everybody. It's being built by a black man, and I walk past it every day, right? You've got AJ Patton, you've got Leon Walker, you've got all of these folks that have figured it out. So I want to, Baumhart helps you get that business acumen to understand, okay, when I look at the 10K, when I look at their balance sheet, what is their bottom line, right? And where's the moonshot? And let's not allow for perfect to be the enemy of good. And so what I love about Baker Tilly is, as a consultant, the numbers just gotta make sense. They don't care if I partner with an MBE. They don't care if I partner with BEP programs. They want me to tap into the BLC leadership and build that diverse pipeline, and we're gonna go national, right? And so Baumhart helped me see that, hey, one, we can't do it alone. And when Marisa says it's up to us to be accountable for the outcomes, that is true. Because again, when you talk about contracting or loans or grants, I know for a fact that Governor Pritzker and the mayor and all these folks are pushing for equity. And we've got MBE goals, and I just wrote an article about this. It's literacy. And it's financial literacy, it's health literacy, right? It's government literacy. And Baumhart helped me understand, I knew the government part, right? But it helped me understand the business and financial literacy. And so, unfortunately, we all got them in our families, business owners that bootstrap, yeah, they make money, but they're business practices. And this is not, they are amazing, right? But you can't go from being a subcontractor, you can't become a BOA, a Ujama, a GMA without good business practices. You just can't, right? And many of those leaders worked for major corporations where they learned, right, those practices and then applied them. And so Baumhart, again, helped me understand that intersection, how to find that moonshot approach, and how to do it for my community. So when I come into the room, again, with Baker Tilly, and I've got Matt in the room and I'm calling him out, he does a diverse developers conference called Develop, where essentially we're putting all of these same players I just named in the same room, and we're providing that technical assistance and helping them see that opportunity. And part of this too, again, and I'm gonna shout out Ariel, in the pandemic, McKinsey put out a report called the Black Business Ecosystem Report. And it was sobering. Because what it said is okay, we keep talking about the clean energy economy and what it could do for black contractors, or the clean energy workforce, or just construction, which I worked at IDOT and I can tell you, systemically, right? There's policies in place that are barriers. But again, if we don't understand that most of our black businesses are truckers, most of our black businesses are in hospitality, most of them are in retail, most of them are in manufacturing, but I'm not talking about advanced manufacturing, I'm talking about you made some in your house and you're selling it. Most of them are in IT, but not software IT, AI, and artificial intelligence, but desktop and infrastructure. And that's just the numbers. And the majority of them are solopreneurs, 5 employees or less. So when I go to a bank, and we've got programs at the state where we're doing loan guarantee, we're doing PLPs, we're doing venture, and we'll get you a competitive interest rate. But it's gotta make sense. Just like in COVID, ARPA pretty much said, give the money away. But you still gotta have tax returns. You still got to actually have seen a loss. We took I-10 business owners, but we still gotta make sure certain things line up. And so what Baumhart has done, right, and what Malik is doing at Loyola, and frankly, what Loyola is doing that a lot of universities are not doing, is not just calling out the data and the research, but then saying, how do we bring the players together to actually move the needle? So you've got a Dory McWhorter who is doing amazing work, right, and helping to educate folks from the nonprofit space. We've got you, Karen, who is serving as this convener and facilitator. And so, I think it's continuing to have conversations like this. All of us in the room right now can move the needle somewhere, right, in education, in entrepreneurship, in affordable housing, in public health. It just is what's in it for me, or what's the ROI, and that's what we get caught up in. And I just want to say to everybody in this room, we can't get caught up in that, because what you're seeing in this report has been the data. I get tired of reading disparity after disparity. Cleveland just did a CBA, and now they're trying to get more MBE contractors. Oakland's got 22% population, 1% participation and achievement. IDOT, there's no black asphalt pavers anywhere. I mean, like, it's these are the facts, right? And so I just think this conversation is so powerful, because yes, there is the awareness preparedness piece, there is the education piece, but there's just the literacy piece. And the last piece I'll say on the literacy piece is, I've got a friend who's a pharmacist at Cook County. And I just want to tell you this story because I think it's important. The guy was in jail for a year, and he found out he had diabetes. And he said, "You gave me that. This jail gave me diabetes. It's the crappy food I get, it's all that." And so in that moment, you've got two ways you can respond. You can blame them. Boy, ain't nobody gave you no diabetes. You can't even get diabetes, in a year. Or you can ask a series of questions and say, "Talk to me about your grandmother. Did she lose her toes? What was her health like?" And all of these different questions that helped them arrive to the fact that they could not have gotten diabetes in jail, right? That's health literacy. I was like, oh my God, because I'm sitting here spending time talking about accounting and CPAs and taxes, right? And I'm not even thinking about that component. So I say all that to say, Karen, is that Baumhart is having the conversation day in and day out, unapologetically, in the business space, and trying to cultivate leaders who are going to do what we're doing here today. And so I just am appreciative that they are coming in the neighborhood, which, by the way, Northwestern, no, I'm just joking. But we're doing it, right? And we're coming to where everyone is. And the last shout out is to Liz Dozier, who put out a report and said, "Why am I being researched so much? Let's stop researching Black people. We got the data. We know what it is. Let's just do it."
Thank you for that. Marisa, we're talking solutions, and I know that you've seen housing become one of the ways to develop and amass wealth, or to build wealth. I also know that the trust is really focused on eliminating the racial wealth gap. But we know it's not one shot, right? So how are you all thinking about that? How are you activating that work in a way that really will allow people to build wealth?
Well, I want to tee this up by saying one of the ways we know that people build wealth in this country is through homeownership. So certainly that is part of the trust's interests in understanding that ecosystem and strengthening it. And I'll borrow from Malik with the statement that homeownership alone won't save Black people, right? In that we know, and everyone in this room knows, that the home buying process is fraught from start to finish if you're buying in a majority Black neighborhood. We already talked about appraisals being problematic. We have this notion that appraisals are somehow a fact-based, you have to find out what your home is worth. Well, when you peel that back, it's just what are people willing to pay for a certain property in a certain neighborhood. That's all it means. And so there's tons and tons of problems baked into that approach. Credit scores, we already talked about. We know that Black communities have been disproportionately targeted for predatory lending. So, of course, we need to come up with some other ways of looking at credit. Mortgage lending, I've already touched on that as well. And then homeowners insurance, costs way more too. So we got a lot of problems. That I don't want to stay in that area, but I do want to pick apart one nuance, because also I don't like to say things like the South and West Side or majority Black neighborhoods as if there's no nuance there, because I do think it's important to note that in neighborhoods like East Garfield Park and Woodlawn, you have one phenomenon, which is kind of increasing home costs but lagging incomes. And so you have local folks who've been there, who've been renting, who would love to put down their stake and give themselves some permanency, and they're struggling with what it now takes to buy in that community. And then in other neighborhoods, you've got a very different problem, which is that the values are so low that there can be a gap of $100,000 or more just between what the cost to build and what the market will bear. And so very different issues depending on the geography. They all need to, have their own specific solution. So I'll just talk about a few things that give me some optimism. One is one that I worked on quite a bit when I was at the Department of Housing. A group called United Power for Action and Justice has built a zero interest construction loan fund to do home ownership efforts at scale in North Lawndale, back of the yards, Roseland. Several banks and philanthropies have contributed to allow them to have a zero interest construction kind of revolving loan that allows them to keep the cost down. Interesting thing that the trust is supporting is a network of developers in applying for new markets tax credits to use toward home ownership as an untapped equity source. That's not typical, and also it's really, really hard. And so it really is smart, I think, to work on that as a cohort where there's technical assistance, because I certainly couldn't walk in off the street and say, I'm going to figure out how to put new markets tax credits into my home ownership deal. That it requires some TA, and so we're trying to come with that. Another thing that I want to build off what Jonathan said. I really had the pleasure during the 4 years I was at the Department of Housing of seeing exponential growth in the number of Black developers and GCs that are in this space. And when I look back to when I was developing affordable housing, or even some of the years that followed, people like Leon Walker, AJ Patton, Phil Beckham, and Juan Saldana, who are doing 43 Green, as Jonathan mentioned, those guys weren't in the mix when it comes to affordable housing. And that has been a much more recent phenomenon, and I think there's a growing infrastructure to support that, which I find really promising. It is not for the faint of heart to walk in and try to do a new markets tax credit deal. I remember my first, sorry, did I say new markets? I mean low-income housing tax credit deal. First time I did a low-income housing tax credit deal, the learning curve is just like mind exploding, right? So the idea that, for instance, Phil and Juan partnered with Habitat to do 43 Green, right? And now in the next deal, they're playing a much deeper role with different benefits to them as a company than they did on the first phase. They've broken ground on phase 2, they're off to the races. But this kind of incremental growth, I think there's an ecosystem that is really building around that in a way that gives me a lot of hope and optimism. I got things I think we absolutely need to do better. That I have ideas about things we should do better, but I don't know if you want me to say that right now or you want me to wait.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
One thing that I know folks at the trust have identified and are working on is better mortgage products for people that are at the low end of the buying scale. So about 80% of the area median income is typically maybe the lowest you might go and feel some comfort with entering into home ownership, given the number of unexpected expenses and so on that can come up. And there's not a lot for that population that actually works. And so there's some efforts aligned around figuring that out and figuring out a better product. Another is just appraisal gap money. Like I mentioned, you've got a neighborhood sometimes that where the values are just not at the cost to construct. And so the only thing you can do there, and truly this is a redress for the ways that these communities have been disinvested in, is to make up the gap. And that simply needs to happen. That is the debt we owe in these communities. And the final thing I'll say is just around holding on to the homeowners we have already, right? We don't want to be so busy creating new housing and new homeownership opportunities, yet we lose longtime owners that maybe just need some repairs in their home in order to keep living there and age in place. Because nobody on a block wins when a home goes into foreclosure and it becomes vacant. That is a universal negative for everybody involved. So those are some things I would point to that I'm really interested in digging into once I get past month 1 in this role.
Well, we are glad to see you there, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our appraisal bias task force that we have launched. I saw our chair come in, and you'll hear more from us about that, but also the fact that we have HUD certified counselors here at the Urban League to really help people with their first time home buying. I want to go back to Theresa to talk about violence as a public health challenge. And we've heard that language, but how does looking at violence as a public health challenge really impact our ability to solve that issue and to solve for that issue?
This is one of my favorite questions. People tend to not think about violence as a public health issue. You think about violence as a criminal justice issue. You think about violence as a policing issue. None of those things are meant to prevent. The goal of public health is to prevent negative things from happening, right? We tell people to wear a mask or cover your cough to prevent the spread of germs. So if we think about the goal of preventing violence, then we can think about it from that same three-level approach that we talked about earlier. We can think about how do we prevent violence from an individual level? How do we prevent it at the community level? And what can we do at the systems or policy level? So at the, and this is just, I'm just gonna give one example from each. This is not like the end all. But at like the individual level, one thing that we can do is conflict resolution, right? So maybe we taught people how to be mad at people and how to address that without hitting, then we won't see violence happen as often. What if we did that for parents? What if we taught parents how to be upset with their children and not hit them? Then maybe we have a generation of children who are not used to being hit and who would then look at people and think that there's other ways that we can address the conflict, right? There's other ways that we can get past someone doing something wrong to them or something bad to them, because now we've taught a new set of skills. We taught that at the individual level. What about at the community level? If at the community level, we didn't cross the street when we see a group of young guys on the corner, or if we didn't hold our purses closer to us when we see a group of guys walking near us, what if instead we said hi? What if we engaged them? What if we learned their names? What if we gave fist bumps? What if we created community? What if we helped young people know that we want you here, we see you here, you are an asset to this community? If we gave people more to live for, then maybe when they see people who look like them, who did something to them, they won't think that their lives are worthless. What about at the systems level? What if we didn't do things like what was done in Chicago last summer and say, youth aren't allowed in public spaces after a certain hour? What if we looked at ageism and said, this is not just a bad thing for elderly, it's a bad thing when we have ageist policies towards our youth? And so, what if we did away with all those ageist policies? What if we did away with movie theaters saying you can't come in after a certain hour if you're a young person? All of these are policies that has a negative impact, because then what are we telling young people they can do, right? Consistently, our youth are told what they can't do. They are almost never told what they can do. And without that, how do we expect any changes? How do we expect them to be able to move from status quo to a place where they value their lives, value the lives of others, and see themselves contributing to the community? So that's the way that we look at violence from a public health perspective, with prevention is key in trying to figure out how we can move forward from there.
Thank you. Malik, I want to kind of give you the last word before we go to the audience for questions. You and your team put this report together in partnership with Dr. Lionel Kimball, who kind of brought it up from the rear. He was the closer. Here's my question. As you think about the data in the context of how we resolve it, how do we look at this 2 years from now, when we come back with the next State of Black Chicago, how do we know if we've been successful? How do we know if we're just coming up with another report to depress people? How do we resolve that?
Well, again, as an academic, I'm going to focus very heavily on research, but not in the typical terms. I do subscribe to what you shared, Jonathan, that we know enough in terms of higher level, but I also want to go back to the point I made earlier, is that we have lots of examples of success that are still needing investigation. So for example, many of the things that Marisa mentioned earlier, as an example, the new growth of developers in the city. Well, how did that come to be? Going back to the notion of literacy, I also subscribe to that as well. We need more literacy on how things can happen in this city. But we live in Chicago, y'all. We understand that there's a way to do things and there's a way to do things. How can we understand this way to do things that you can't find in a textbook? It doesn't exist in a textbook. The only way to do that is to sit down with people who've been successful and to ask them how. And those folks who've been successful, it's incumbent upon them to pay it forward. Just like someone made intros to these individuals, for those individuals, how can we ensure that they are doing the same for others? And when I think about, and why I'm so blessed to work at a place like Loyola University, Chicago, I think about some of the projects that we're taking on. One of them is actually evaluating the work that's being done through the trust during the height of the pandemic and some of the funding that was injected into cities to help us resolve some of these issues. As part of the evaluation team, we're capturing some of that information. We're trying to figure out exactly, we've seen a program that has potential, but to your point, is it meeting the desired outcomes? Then how can we take that information and convert it into ways that any person can understand? That's one of the critiques of academia. We're talking to ourselves as academics. And that's one of the things that I take great pride in having the Institute for Racial Justice, because our litmus test is if my grandmother could not understand this thing, then we need to go back to the drawing board. And part of the work that we're going to be doing along with the Chicago Urban League is thinking about some of these issues that are plaguing our city and ensuring that not only are we highlighting what's wrong, but also solutions based on what's been done right. And there are folks in our local government who are doing amazing work. And oftentimes we subscribe to the notion that there's nothing that can come, why should we partner with government officials and so on and so forth. But we're not going to get out of this predicament alone. It's going to take policymakers. It's going to take researchers. It's going to take funders. It's going to take all of us coming together like we are today, but it can't just be these conversations. The conversation can't end with this. We're going to have to take the lessons learned from today and come back to the table again and say, okay, what did we hear? What is there still yet to learn? And how do we move forward as a collective? Utilizing all of our networks. And one of the things that's great about, again, teaching at and researching at Loyola University, Chicago, is that the work that we're doing in the community is coming back to the classroom. Like Jonathan mentioned, with the Baumhart Scholars. That's one of the things that's very different about Loyola from some of the other institutions that shall go unnamed throughout the city. If you think about the work that's to be done, like a supplier diversity initiative, right? And you see all of these reports that are out here that are made by and for folks like us. Oftentimes when you take a peek behind the curtain and you see who was actually behind the scenes crunching those numbers, they do not look like us. It's almost as if we don't look at researchers and scholars as community members too. So that's some of the work that we're doing with the Institute for Racial Justice, is trying to figure out how to create a bigger tent, a diverse tent. So it's not just about an organization like the League saying, hey, give us some numbers on this thing and we'll holler at you later once we do the work. No, we want to be at the table with you. We want to work alongside with you, because even if we don't live in some of these communities that are impacted, we grew up in those communities. We still have relatives in those communities. And even if they're not in this state, we have relatives back in other states, in communities just like these. We care. We're committed to this work. and we can do more than just crunch numbers. So success for me is the number of reports, and not just reports, but the action items that stem from those reports that I can confidently say that Loyola as a whole, not just the Institute for Racial Justice, had a hand in moving the needle forward. And collaborating with the Chicago Urban League, Chicago Community Trust, and other organizations throughout the city is a way for us to make that impact that we so desire.
Thank you for that. Questions for our panelists? I mean, they have been dropping nuggets all morning, but we want to hear from our audience.
Hi, how are you? Ariel Johnson with Business Leadership Council. Thank you for Karen for just leading us in so many ways. Wanted to ask about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is workforce development. I know that the report actually kind of started off in talking about unemployment rates in the Black community, direct correlation to poverty as well as home ownership, et cetera. And so interested to hear your thoughts at BLC, where our primary mission is building the Black business ecosystem. I don't think any business ecosystem exists without a quality workforce. And so specifically within the Black communities, our Black business community at BLC, what are your thoughts on workforce? How do we push that? And just identifying some of the consistent barriers there that prevent true progress.
I'm gonna keep it short, I promise. Ariel, that was the thing that's been on my mind on this panel that we haven't got to, so thank you so much for answering that. Workforce is first, and the problem is we thought about it last. And I'm just gonna use a good example. Now, we all were happy when Discover went to 87. I was excited, I was a part of the deal. I was like, this is gonna be great. They are struggling to recruit the Black people in their community. And so this is near and dear. So to Malik's point, why is that happening? Who's talking to them, and who's figuring out as to why they don't see that as a place for them to grow an amazing career at a financial institution? Well, what you'll find is, and we're seeing this cross-sector, it's the social safety net, which is essentially why we talk about apprenticeships, right? And some of the main barriers to them getting placed in the labor trades, and I'll just say it is marijuana, okay? Basic things that are barriers to workforce, or the box, whether you've had an interaction with law. I got pulled over the other day for no reason. Like, there are some systemic barriers to Black people getting in corporate, getting in nonprofit, getting into the trades. And so when you talk about businesses, there is no clean energy contractor with a clean energy worker. There is no asphalt paver without a journeyman who's become, and that jumps off the porch because an urban league helps them and gets the capital. So workforce development is pivotal. And on top of that, what's happening is you've got developers, right, who do want to do the right thing. But, which is why the CBA conversation and CBP conversation is just exploding. Where's that advisory council and resident council that is tracking and looking at the metrics and making sure that if childcare is an issue, or transportation is an issue, or just you need money to get to work every day, that's happening, because the money is there and it's in the budget. But somehow in between the development happening, the jobs getting created, citizens seeing the cranes, and then just seeing other people go to work in their community, but they never get the job offer, or no one's knocking on their door. So it goes back to that community navigator approach. And Brandy Canazzi, who's the commissioner of DFSS, talks about this. Community navigators aren't just for business. It's for rental assistance, right? It's for social services. Because again, part of what I see happening in Chicago too is that we keep creating new programs and policies when there's already existing resources and no one is helping them navigate that, right? So there is funding for apprenticeships, there's funding for workforce development, the Cook County Workforce Partnership has funding, but we've got to align and connect those dots, and that's just not happening. And so, Ariel, I think the solution for that is, how do we as government, how do we as the trust, how does we as the Urban League find specific areas where we need to build that workforce? And you know, I'll stop there because I think other folks will definitely have things to share on that.
I'll jump in on this one, because you only have to go to the second floor of this building. Is Andrew Wells in the house? He's probably working. Andrew leads our workforce development department, and not only is he developing jobs in green industry, we have solar installation, we have EV installation, we have solar sales, we have a drone academy, we have all of those things, but he also partners with people who are looking for employees to get them acclimated to not just getting jobs, but developing careers. The last thing that I will say is that there is an entire group called the Community-Based Organization Collective that also is dedicated to working with employers to get people into careers in their organizations. It's just a matter of marrying, and as Jonathan alluded to, creating that ecosystem and, kind of the community navigator approach. And here's what we understand. There's some folks who have records. You can do most jobs with a record, right? You don't have to say that, felons need not apply. In fact, some of the most resourceful people I know, having practiced law for 20 years as a criminal lawyer, are felons. So hire them. And so creating these artificial, and I think Marisa said it when she was talking about credit, right? But creating these artificial barriers for employment are just unnecessary. And we have to talk to employers in that way, business owners, so that they understand that. I saw a question over here, and then I'm gonna come back. Okay. Yes. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Hey, everybody. Ashley Munson, Obama Foundation. Question for the foundation, but mainly myself. This information is super helpful for me in my work, my research, and things like that. I am a product of Northwestern, so I'll say that. But what are you all doing to make this information more palatable for the next generation? I think Jonathan mentioned it as far as civics and that being important to this group, but also the generation after us, so that we can make better strides in the community and create better pipelines. What are you all doing to help that generation understand what's happening here, so they can see that this is important to all of our futures?
So I will tell you, is Dr. Kimball or Lionel? Okay, his hand, we just had this conversation yesterday, and thank you, Ashley, for raising that. Social media. And, I know some folks just really don't like social media, but it is useful. So look for this information on TikTok. Look for this information on IG, but also look for it in our Youth and Family Services Department as we engage our young people in taking this message to their peers and taking this message to the community in a different way.
If I could also chime in, I want to shout out Sophie Duque, right there. Right? She is our person who's over marketing and communications, and to build on Karen's point, she's currently taking information embedded in the State of Black Chicago report and creating messaging via Instagram and LinkedIn and other, I don't know where, or we're not on TikTok yet, but some of the other outlets. To your point, that's more accessible for that generation. And I'd also like to piggyback on the workforce development question. So in terms of a project that the Institute for Racial Justice is working on right now, we're collaborating with Loyola's Business School. We've received 3 years worth of federal funding to investigate all of the outlets that are designed to provide information for where to find jobs, how to create your own business, and so on and so forth. There are so many. Just because something is available doesn't necessarily mean that it's accessible. There's so much information out there that people are confused about the quality of where to go, who to go to, and who should I talk to. And again, that thing that's written on the site versus the real literacy, what's happening out here. So that's a partnership with the Quinlan School of Business. But we're also taking that project and copying and pasting it, so to speak, in the South Chicago community. So as some of you know, Fifth Third Bank has committed $20 million to South Chicago. We are the research partner for that funding, to understand exactly what are the services offered in the community. You're saying that this information is available. Are people actually using it? And if they're not, why not? We're understanding that just because information is available, and a bank, for example, may say, well, here are the criteria for individuals to gain access to this funding. If folks can't meet that criteria, is it something that the individuals need to do differently, or is it something that the bank needs to do differently? This is the sort of research that we're embarking on. This idea of transparency and exposing, so to speak, some of the things that are taken for granted as being accessible and available to people that in reality truly are not.
That is a wonderful point, Malik. A lot of people made commitments to fund or to provide funds to the community after the murder of George Floyd. But if you can't meet the criteria that was set out for those commitments to be realized, did you really make the commitment, or did you just make an announcement? So that's real. I've got one question here, and I'm gonna have to make a hard decision because we're at the end, so we'll figure that out. I'll let Jonathan advise me on that.
So Claude Robinson with Onyx Strategic Partners. I really appreciate the report because it is centering Black folks. And we talked a lot about the different barriers based on certain aspects of life. I wanted to ask the question, how do we deal with Black folks who've been fully indoctrinated in the beliefs and the behaviors of white supremacy?
We got two PhDs sitting up here. That sounds like a PhD.
That sounds like a PhD question.
You know, I think that is a conversation we have to have in our community. And you call people out. And you do it with love and patience and all of the fruits of the Spirit, because you don't need it to deal with those folks. But you really do have to address it head on, because when you have Black people like that, they are also a barrier and an impediment to progress. And sometimes they believe that they are being helpful, and sometimes they just don't care. And you distinguish between the two, because the ones that don't care, you send them to live where they're most comfortable. And the ones that do care, then you educate them to make them useful.
So Nicole, right there, she's been really.
Nicole.
Thank you. Nicole Johnson. Question for Marisa. You mentioned about the appraisal gap, and you mentioned that, I'm just curious if there are any existing initiatives across the country where financial institutions are contributing to that gap in appraisal from, my house in 60621 and then one in 60623.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's actually something I'm very new in this role, but not new to housing issues. And I know that, just as Karen said, there have been lots of groups working on this issue for years. So the Urban League has an effort. I'm sure you're working with Neighborhood Housing Services, which has also been trying to get at, and I know the NHS-led group is working on, I think, a bill in Springfield that would make some, I think it's not just like all legislation, it's not exactly what they wanted, but it was what they felt they could get passed, which is, at a minimum, how do you challenge, that you have a right to challenge your appraisal.
Yes.
That's obviously a downstream solution to getting better appraisals or setting up a different system to begin with that purposefully solves for the fact that we know that properties in majority Black neighborhoods are priced lower than their worth. So I right before I left the city, I was put in touch with a researcher at UIC who is coming up with a bunch of alternatives alternative ways to try to get at valuing property, especially noting the forces at play in places that have long been devalued. So this is like, I probably have, and I'll tell you the truth, I have, there's amazing people who've been working on this at the trust who, if they were here, would be like, let me answer this. I got a better answer. I'm still getting up to speed on what they've been researching. It's something, given our focus at the trust on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, it's a huge part of the equation, no doubt about it. And I'm certainly very interested in figuring out how philanthropy can play a role in supporting, whether it's research, pilots, or, you know, if we already know there's been ideas that have been piloted, how do we get them out on the ground?
One last question.
Okay, this is one person. We talked about accountability, we talked about self to system, systems to self. So the question I have is, when you are accountable for yourself, because all these people in this room are accountable to the Black community. So when you're accountable and you're working inside of these institutions, can you give us one, and just it could just be one person, one thing where you came across that challenge, but you were so accountable to seeing that come through? What did you do to kind of get around that system?
I think that's a perfect question to end. So I'm going to ask everyone to answer that question and start with Marisa and just come right back down.
Okay.
And just, I want you to repeat it. How, repeat it, because.
Well, it's just really like, if we're accountable to making sure we have better outcomes, it sounds like many of you are individually, personally accountable to yourself and to your community. So with that being said, you're going inside these organizations that already have these barriers. So when you hit that barrier as somebody that's personally accountable and responsible, how are you dealing with that barrier, and how, give me an example of how you're moving around it so that when we leave out of here, we've got some ammunition.
Thank you, that's a beautiful question. I'll go back to something that I alluded to when we did the racial equity impact assessment of the way that the city had used its low-income housing tax credits. A little bit before that, in 2019, we took a look at where transit-oriented developments had occurred in the city of Chicago. So back in 2013, city passed an ordinance saying basically developments near transit should have more density and have less parking because you're right near a transit stop, right? And the law got subsequently strengthened several times since then. But when we mapped in 2019, so this was why it's important to break things down by race and geography. You could say, oh, look, we got 150 transit-oriented developments since 2013. Awesome. Except when you map them and you find out that 90% of them are on the north side, downtown, and West Loop, right? Knowing that we have massive transit assets on the south and west side as well. So what we saw there was a failure of two things. One, failure of the market, and two, frankly, failure of government. And so here's the part I could control, right? In our next funding round, we emphasized the importance of south and west side land near transit. And then when we funded, 18 out of the 24 developments that we funded were transit-oriented developments, but 12 out of those 18 were on the south and west sides, and include developments like Jonathan mentioned, 43 Green Phase 2, for instance, Park Station Lofts right near the 63rd and Cottage Station, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I think, but if you don't know your own data and you don't know where you're missing, you might not think to emphasize that and solve for it.
Malik?
Data, I love it. One of the roles that I've taken on is serving as the DEI co-chair for the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce's, this is a new steering committee that's come about. We have our first meeting next Monday, but just quite frankly, looking at the list of folks who are on the committee that was not of my choosing, I'm anticipating that there will be some resistance, and I'm preparing for it. It's always best to have an plan A, B, C, D, E, and F. But there's a brother here who I met at the Baumhart Scholars event last week. I did a guest lecture, and he asked just a profound question, and it actually caused me to act. He said, so how, in this role, this new position, will you not allow your ideals, your value, your sense of self, and your commitment to your community to be co-opted by this group. And when I left that meeting, I was like, damn it, that was a great question. So what I did was sit down with the co-chairs and just say, okay, this is what I stand for. This is what I'm trying to have as an end result. And this is some of the data that I would like for us as a chamber to collaborate with others across the city to produce. And everyone signed off on it. And as long as we're clear in written form that this is what we're trying to accomplish, I have no problem walking away if it doesn't speak to my spirit. So there are certain times when we all need to be at the table, but there's also certain times we need to get up from that table and walk away. This is not the table for us. I don't like this food here. It's not tasty. So I'm comfortable enough in understanding that if this plan A isn't going to be, the steering committee isn't the solution, and I can always go to places like the Trust, I can always go to places like the Chicago Urban League and collaborate with like-minded individuals who can move the needle.
Theresa?
I'm the product of a HBCU, and our school motto was, I'll find a way or make one. And I've carried that with me throughout my career. I will find a way or make one. And if I get a no, I just interpret it as you didn't understand my question, or you were the wrong person to give me the yes. And so I'm never stopping at a no. I'm finding out how I can push, who I need to ask, who I need to get behind me to help support my ask. I'm getting to a yes. It might not be a yes today, but it will be a yes tomorrow.
So I'm going to approach this from two different ways, because I've worked at the state, I now work at a corporation, I've worked at the Trust, I went to Loyola, and I've worked in pretty much every capacity that you can, and I'm a millennial, so you know it hit different for us. I do have this set phrase, and the day I lose my job for doing my job is a job well done, period. Now, within reason. Okay. You gotta eat. You know, you gotta get a paycheck. And you can't burn the house down, right? Even when you realize that the emperor ain't got no clothes. And so, you know, I think at the state, what Ariel and I had to navigate, and shout out Bruce Montgomery and all the people that's outside, right, that can put that pressure on the right folks. It's exactly what, you know, we've talked about as chestnut checkers, right? And I think that we have to, one, understand how to communicate, how people can hear things and how to communicate with people who only receive information a certain way. I repeat, learning how to communicate with people that only receive information a certain way. So it may not be fair, it ain't right. So when George Floyd happened and I said we need to put out a statement, and they said, well, we'll send it just to the Black business community. Governor Pritzker sent one out already. I said, you know, how do I navigate this? And so what had happened was we actually had built coalitions with people who didn't look like us at the department. And we ended up sending that out to everybody, right? But it was met with resistance, but I didn't give up and I didn't get mad. Like, oh, they don't care about no Black folks. You know, I ain't working here, right? I'll give you an example at Baker Tilly. I got a utilization rate that I got to meet of 80%. And we've got a business development. And then within that business development, you have a realization, which is if you have a $100,000 contract, how much of that money are we going to realize, right? And how much are we writing off? And so it gets even tougher. However, again, consultants receive information in a different way. And so I found myself like we need to do this, like, you know, Baker Tilly's that's a diverse development, we're in Chicago, like, and I realized that I wasn't talking to them in a way that they could understand it. So I put it in a way a consultant can understand. And someone talked about this. What's the cost of us not doing this? You flip it, right? The cost of us not having an MBE and WBE formalized program is that our clients will find somewhere else to go, right? And so also, what are the drivers and motivators for people? In politics, it's the people. When they feel the heat, they see the light. So if you on the inside, there's only so much you can say, you under pressure, it's all types of stuff. And I think in government, in some cases, when you reach that point, you gotta walk away. And that's okay for me to say, because I think you can go to the Trust. You can go to a firm that believes in that. You can go become an entrepreneur, which I will just say this too. For some people, it's starting your own business and dreaming your own vision. And you'd be surprised that all these people in this room will get behind you.
Thank you. I'll answer it. Two things. In every meeting that I go in, I look for a like-minded person that at any given time you might have to partner with them. You may know them, you may not, to just set it off in a meeting, because you just never know. But the last thing I will say is that there is a lot of power in this room. And with a lot of power comes responsibility. And you have to be willing to not only wield the power, but also embrace and make sure you're using that power responsibly. Thank you all. Thank our panelists. But thank you all for being an amazing audience, but also being a committed community. This concludes our panel.